In the ye olden days, before Primaris Marines, or even the first Tau Codex, Wizards of the Coast set up a third-party licensing system called the Open Gaming License. Under the Open Gaming License, or the OGL, third parties could take the core rules of Dungeons & Dragons and do with them whatever they wanted. Pathfinder 1st Edition was published under the OGL, taking the core rules of 3rd Edition Dungeons & Dragons and repurposing it to make a new system that directly competed for the attention of D&D players, and succeeded. Pathfinder, during the active support of D&D 4th Edition, made more money and was more popular than 4th Edition. Speaking as a regular con-goer during this time, it was a lot easier to find Pathfinder tables than D&D tables, even for a while after 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons came out, because by the time 5e replaced 4th edition, Pathfinder already gained so much momentum. All of the expansion Kickstarters that you've seen sponsoring a ton of content creators, the Critical Role supplements, and yes, even the Book of Erotic Fantasy, were all made under the OGL. The Open Gaming License allowed a cottage industry of fan-made third-party expansion content for D&D to not only come into existence, but to thrive. And earlier last month, Wizards of the Coast issued Order 66 on this grassroots industry with the OGL 1.1. The exact details of the OGL 1.1 are beyond the scope of this video, but I can give a few highlights. Within the new Open Gaming License, it revokes the legitimacy of the old license, something Wizards of the Coast previously said was written to be impossible specifically to avoid this kind of situation. Forces publishers to give a 25% cut to Wizards of the Coast for any sales above $750,000, and I quote, non-exclusive, perpetual, irrevocable, worldwide, sub-licensable, royalty-free license to use any content created under the OGL for any purpose. Ignore the fact that they just revoked the last licensing contract they called irrevocable. Fan outrage in response was so profound and so massive that Wizards of the Coast not only had to back down, but actively revert their changes. Not only would they not be enforcing the new OGL 1.1, they are actively making the 5.1 SRD, basically the core rules of D&D 5th edition, available under a Creative Commons license, which probably seems like a more substantial victory to most people than it actually is. The fight's not over just because Wizards of the Coast retracted on this one front. You don't declare victory in a war just because you win one battle. Wizards of the Coast is still a garbage company. They still don't deserve your money. They still think D&D is quote-unquote under-monetized, and they are actively scheming on ways to screw you over as soon as this blows over. It's no coincidence that Wizards of the Coast announced that they'd be putting the SRD 5.1 under a CC license the same day Hasbro announced they'd be laying off 15% of their total workforce. It's a cover. It's a smokescreen. They're shaking our hands with their right hand while their left sits behind their back with a dagger in it. Wizards of the Coast is almost the epitome of the evil megacorporation, seeking to maintain an iron-fisted grip over an industry through whatever means it can get away with, rather than simply trying to make the best game. And I'm glad that people are starting to agree. However, I noticed that a lot of people are saying something along the lines of, "You're right, I'll keep up the good fight by playing 5th edition, but not supporting Wizards of the Coast, or even going back to an out-of-print edition of the game." And fine, if that's your prerogative, I can't stop you, but that's not going to change anything. Wizards of the Coast already has the most money, so simply not giving them your money isn't actually going to change anything. They're still going to be the company with the most money. Instead, what you have to do, if you want to rid the tabletop role-playing game sphere of the control of a single megacorporation, if that's what you want, then you have to support other games, other studios, and other projects. A great example of this would be Pathfinder. When people didn't like 4th edition, they didn't just keep playing 3.5. They moved on to Pathfinder. They gave money in droves to a competitor, and when they did that influenced Wizards of the Coast to change their course, far more than a mere exodus of players back to an older version of their own game. So, now that we're on the same page as each other, here's some recommendations I have for other games that aren't D&D, ordered from most to least similar to D&D itself. Yeah, gotcha! Bet when you saw the title of this video you didn't think it'd be a top 10 list, did ya? Well, it's not. It's actually a top 5 list. Yeah, whatever. Pathfinder. Yeah, this one was obvious. Pathfinder is a riff on D&D 3.5 made by OGL content studio Paizo, who makes third-party expansions for Dungeons & Dragons and their own games. Pathfinder uses the core rules of D&D 3.5, so anyone who's played 3.5 will find Pathfinder's rules very familiar. And even then, if you've played 5th edition, it's not that big of a leap, since 5th edition itself was built on a very similar foundation to 3.5. It's set in a very similar fantasy setting, and like D&D, is also very easy to decouple from the pre-established setting in order to set it inside your own world. It's a fun, much crunchier offshoot of D&D that definitely has a lot of DNA from the game's older iterations, in that it's significantly more gamey, but honestly that's a good thing in my book. If you're looking to wean off of D&D and explore what the rest of the medium has to offer without too quickly exiting your comfort zone, then Pathfinder is a good next step. Keeping with the theme of D20 systems for one more entry is the D20 Star Wars game, like the ones from the early 2000s. Yeah, these were actually made by Wizards of the Coast when they acquired TSR and thus the rights to the D&D system, and was one of their first and only attempts at a licensed TTRPG set in a popular universe. But I thought the goal of this was as a way to stop giving Wizards of the Coast as much money and play other games to encourage positive change in the community. And yes, but that's just the thing. This game's no longer in print. You cannot give Wizards of the Coast money by playing it. This was made in the early 2000s, and from what I can tell was kind of a financial failure, because it's basically impossible to find used copies of the physical rulebooks, and when you do, they cost hundreds of dollars. The game's no longer in print, and is only accessible through buying either a $500 used copy, or piracy. Just piracy. And honestly, I remember this game being really good when I ran it as a kid. A lot of people still apply the all Jedi or no Jedi rule to this game, but honestly, I had both Jedi and non-Jedi in my campaigns, and it went pretty well. Though, in fairness, when I was a kid, we already had the Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic games, the Clone Wars TV show. Yes, I am flaunting my youth to my audience whose median age is 35, but we were already very well versed in the ways in which non-Force sensitive characters could reasonably pose a challenge to a Jedi, much more so than the role players in the 80s who only had the original trilogy and a smattering of books to go off of. Again, I think this is one of those weaning off of D&D kind of games, when you want to branch out, but not that quickly. Which I get. New things are scary, and we don't want to jump headlong into the deep end of a hero system or a fatal. I get that it can be daunting to go from roll charisma to roll for anal circumference, but we gotta move on eventually. And for that, I want to start by recommending a few systems that are significantly simpler than Dungeons & Dragons. Masks, Apocalypse World, Dungeon World, Avatar Legends, Thirsty Sword Lesbians. Sure, all of these games have one thing in common, and that's that they are powered by the apocalypse. Powered by the Apocalypse is the name of a design framework used across several companies for dozens of different games, but each of them share the same core rules. Players take actions, not by going through a list of abilities, but by just saying what they're gonna do, and then rolling 2d6. 6, 7, 8, and 9 are successes, 10, 11, and 12 are critical successes, and 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are misses. That's it. You now know how to play every single Powered by the Apocalypse system, more or less. PBTA is a philosophy of tabletop role-playing game design that almost completely de-emphasizes the G part in TTRPG, and instead uses only the lightest possible rule set to create funnels by which narratives are devised. It's an engine for storytelling rather than a game about loot, and that's kind of why I'm not specifically recommending any particular game here, because what you see is kind of what you get. There's minor differences in the rules between each system, and each system usually has at least one special game mechanic, which usually just means a different reason to roll 2d6. But all of that is tertiary. The game itself takes a back seat to the narrative and to the theme. So really, I can't recommend any particular PBTA game, but rather just different themes. Masks is superheroes, specifically teenage superheroes, but you can get away with them being adults. Apocalypse World is for games set in the post-apocalypse, and is also literally the game which gives this entire system its name. Dungeon World is for those looking for a fantasy adventure, and Thirsty Sword Lesbians should be pretty self-explanatory about who it appeals to. Are you a thirsty sword lesbian? Then this is the one for you. You get a bunch of friends together, and spend a few evenings just appreciating the art of improv storytelling. And thirsty sword lesbians. Still want to play with some D6s? Do you have a comfort zone that's more particular to this channel's audience? Well, goddamn, should you play Soulbound. Soulbound is a Warhammer Age of Sigmar role-playing game where you play as a band of adventurers whose souls are bound. The whole premise of the game is that you are champions of your people's god who have been enlisted by those gods to complete some kind of mutually beneficial task. This setup pretty seamlessly allows for characters of any Grand Alliance to be in the same party, and in fact, the game makes mention of that fact. The expansion content, Champions of Destruction, Champions of Death, and the upcoming Champions of Chaos are all centered around giving more fleshed out rules for playing as non-order characters, with each race having a lore entry called Unlikely Heroes, which describes why an Ironjaw's orc or a vampire lord might be in a binding with a Fire Slayer or a Lumineth Realm lord, which usually comes down to even rival gods have mutual enemies. In terms of gameplay, Soulbound is one of my favorite systems ever, and where I don't want to bog down the video with specifics, I will just say that Soulbound is a perfect middle ground of light enough rules to not get in the way, but still crunchy enough to give a dirty power gamer like me something to really sink my teeth into. A feeling unrivaled by all except for the FFG 40k games, which are also fantastic, by the way. I just don't want to put 2 Warhammer games on this list. Too bad I'm gonna do it anyway, because the next entry is Wrath and Glory. Wrath and Glory is the newest Warhammer 40,000 tabletop role-playing game, following up a legacy of excellence with Fantasy Flight's Games' series of Warhammer 40,000 RPGs. And it's the final entry on this list. Black Crusade is in my top 3 favorite TTRPGs of all time, so it was gonna be a really tough act to follow. In fact, originally I put Black Crusade on here instead of Wrath and Glory, but Wrath and Glory succeeds in trying to do its own thing, rather than simply follow in the footsteps of those other games. Again, so as to not bog down the video in a bunch of rules explanations, I'll just keep it brief. Wrath and Glory uses a system of dice pools, and uses them to create a ton of narrative tension and genuine decision-making nuance, even with its most simple archetypes. For as much as I love Soulbound, a good deal of its archetypes basically have 0 decision points during gameplay. Like, if you're a Kurnoth Hunter, you're going to be doing this exact series of moves every round of combat. Charge, 76 melee attack, metal, 66 melee attack. For every round, that is your turn. In comparison, the glory mechanic means that even a no-brain beat stick archetype, like the Crusader or the Tactical Space Marine, have a decent number of decisions to make every round of combat because of how they interact with resource mechanics that are spread out across the entire party. The reason why I put this game on the list instead of BC is because this is a game that is still being actively supported by the developers, and is still seeing new expansion content, and is still currently in print. Buy it! Almost every game on this list is still in print, and that's for a reason, because we cannot free ourselves from the grip of Wizards of the Coast's control over the industry unless we pump money into other games, other systems. For the last decade, nothing else in the industry has even come close to being able to touch D&D's bottom line, because rising tides did not float all boats. Games like Masks, Pathfinder, Vampire the Masquerade, Shadowrun, all simply sunk. Their popularity did not increase with the tabletop role-playing game's meteoric rise into mainstream popularity in the 2010s. And as a result, there was nothing any other company could do to actually meaningfully compete with D&D. That has now changed. This is a rare moment in time where D&D is uniquely vulnerable. Faith in the company, which was slowly being degraded by the last few really big-name adventure modules / quasi-expansions of Strixhaven and Spelljammer, both kind of sucking, suddenly plummeted overnight because of the OGL 1.1. And Wizards of the Coast trying desperately to walk back on the authoritative, iron-gripped language of the original terms has not been terribly convincing. If we don't capitalize on this now, I don't think we ever will. We either take this opportunity to rally around supporting other creators, other studios, other games, or D&D becomes the next, well, Warhammer 40k, with Wizards of the Coast being able to squeeze as much money out of their fans and players as they possibly can, because they know that most of them won't even know there's a whole other world of tabletop role-playing games out there. I truly believe that D&D only has as much of an iron grip on the medium as it does, simply because most people who play D&D don't even know that other TTRPGs exist. You don't know what you don't know, and so if all you know is D&D, it can be hard to find where the next step in your journey of tabletop role-playing should be, and oftentimes even harder to convince your group to take that next step with you. So I give this video onto you, for you to use as a guide and a reference point on what games I recommend to people trying to leave the tight confines of only knowing how to play a single system. D&D isn't the only thing out there. Other TTRPGs exist. And Wizards of the Coast is terrified of you realizing that fact. Have a good one.
Tomorrow, all will be known, and you're not alone. So don't be afraid in the dark and cold. But the bard songs will remain. They all will remain in my thoughts and in my dreams. They're always in my mind. These songs of hobbits, dwarves, and men, and